Great taste. Sweet. Sour. So good to taste.
Welcome to Great Taste. I'm your host, Steve Boss, and you are listening. Maybe some of you are viewing our latest segment, and I'm very excited to talk with Makenna Held. We're going to get into what we're really going to talk about very shortly, but first of all, I want to just talk a little bit about her. I'm going to use her words for the most part to tell you a little bit about her. On Instagram, she describes herself as this way: cooking, business, and life are all more delicious without recipes. So that's going to figure into most of our conversation. But I have to say that she's been described by one writer as a serial entrepreneur. And when I was reading about Makenna, is it weird listening to me talk about you like this?
Kind of. But I'm at this point in my life, I'm pretty used to it.
Okay. It's like, I'll tell you what, I was so confused. I didn't know what were you, I mean, I'm like, there's all these balls and she's like the greatest juggler in the world. I've never seen anybody juggle so many balls, somebody who's got a family. Are you still taking a master's and a philosophy program too, PhD program? Are you finished with those things? Oh my God.
Still in them.
Okay. All right. I'm just going to read some of the stuff that's on that you have in your Facebook profile. Leadership coach, entrepreneur, catalyst for unreasonable living. Like that one. Quadruple business CEO. Start with a vintage enameled cast iron Dutch oven. Teal is her favorite. I actually, that's a little bright for me, but that's okay. Then saute a mirepoix of business acumen, marketing and strategy. Pour in a good bottle of integral coaching methodology. Add a cup of movement and spirituality and a hearty handful of feminist theory. Whisk gently. I wonder if that's an interesting choice of words. Whisk gently. Follow with a sprinkle each of intuition, ride comedy, and truth talking, and finally a dash of Tibetan theories of emptiness, no less. No less was my comment. Place in the sun for 2 hours, and voila, you'd have Makenna. Makenna Held is a leadership coach, chef, and author, and she's got a new book that's going to be coming out sometime because she just signed a contract for that. She'll tell us about that a little bit later. But what we're really going to talk about is the Courageous Cooking School, because in 2015, after she read an article in the November 12th New York Times, she followed reading that article with, as she says, the wild hair of her intuition and managed to purchase, with the help of investors, La Pichoune, Julia Child's former summer home in Provence. Hi.
You know what? What's really interesting is that when I wrote all of that, coming from someone else, it sounds wilder than it actually is. But I'm here for it. I'm so here for it.
Well, I can't wait to get into talking about the school. But what I love, because you were talking a little bit about it in somewhere else, I don't remember where it was. You were talking about that at age 4, you began a borderline obsession with escargot and mussels.
Yes.
And I thought, okay, I'm not sure there are that many young kids at age 4 that would have a borderline obsession with escargot and mussels. Cooked in butter, parsley, wine, and garlic, of course. Absolutely. Beautiful.
Course.
And you were influenced by the lilting voice of the French chef. So there you go. I mean, why? No wonder you ended up where you are.
Sure. Yeah, no, where do I even start? Right. So I grew up in a family that had a father that was an uber Francophile and was really into food and wine. And at the time, when I was a small child, he was actually a vice president of new concepts at, can we mention brand names? Is that okay?
Sure, go ahead.
He was the vice president of new concepts at Taco Bell when I was growing up. So,
wait a minute. You mentioned, wait a minute. I have that here somewhere. It's somewhere. What is this? I got to put my glasses on. Is this still true that you have an obsession still with, current food love still with Taco Bell?
Well, that's kind of changed, but I'll explain why it changed.
Okay. Okay.
So my father worked for Taco Bell, Frito-Lay, PepsiCo for a very long time. So he was super into food. And I know that sounds weird to work for a company like that, but he, like me, didn't really know how to get into fine food without being a chef or a sommelier, which just wasn't in his trained trajectory. Sure. And so he took his love of food at a place like Taco Bell, he was an executive, and tried to make Taco Bell better. And he was one of the people responsible for fire sauce, which now has been eclipsed by the Diablo, if you're talking about heat. But the flavor, I don't know. I mean, you might have opinions on it if you ever eat at Taco Bell. But he was responsible for fire sauce. And he did a lot of really important work in early, can we call it early? No, like mid into late 80s, which was also kind of like the mid mark of fast food culture, where fast food was still trying to find a voice. And so he was very important in finding that voice. But he was also super obsessed with French culture and French food. And so he took his love of French culture and French food and used his salary from a place like that to cart his family over to France regularly.
Nice.
And it was long before I went to France that I fell in love with mussels and escargot. It was in a tiny little restaurant about 15 minutes from where I grew up that had this amazing garden. And it was the type of fancy restaurant. It was called Cafe Piccolo. It was I don't think it's around anymore. It might be. It was in Long Beach. I could look it up, but I don't think it's still there. But it had this amazing garden. And so it was a place where they could take their hyperactive, clearly I'm hyperactive, was you, the way you explained my bio was just like, acknowledge that. Lots of interests, but it was a place where they could take their child safely, where she could be busy long before the existence of phones. And I learned a lot about food going there. And I learned a lot about food going to Taco Bell too, honestly. Like, and so let me harken back to why I'm not so obsessed with Taco Bell at the same level I used to be, because I've lived in France so long now. I've lost my taste, which is kind of a bummer.
We're not going to tell anybody. So
the pandemic did it to me. I usually went back home. Home is now France. I used to go back to the States 2 to 3 times a year. And because of the pandemic, I didn't go back for almost a year and a half. And so when I went back, it was hotly disappointing. And I think it's just because my palate changed. And that's kind of how life does.
I mean, I think it's funny, personally, hearing you talk about that a little bit, just because you're not someone who's new to food. I mean, obviously, we just talked about how from the age of 4, you were eating escargot and mussels, but you also went to culinary school. So, I mean, it's not like you, are just some random cook, home cook, like I would call myself. And I want to really get into the school, because it's very exciting for me just to have read about it and to understand. Yes, somebody understands how I look at cooking too that way. I mean, that's like my ideal way of looking at cooking. I love it so much. So I'm really happy to talk with you. But I want to let's clear up the Julia Child Association first, because I'm sure when people hear and they listen, and you get asked all the time, you bought her home in Provence and you have a cooking school there, and you do have a number of things that you share in common. Like, I guess you're very tall, right?
Yes, I'm 6'1", which is pretty
you're
tall.
6'1". Julia Child was tall. You're deeply passionate about French cooking, right? That's the same. You went to Smith College. Both of you went to Smith College. That's another thing. Probably. Oh, okay. I see. One of the notes that I see is that you both have an attitude that's about the same. It's like, what the hell? Okay, great. Anyway, but what you're doing there is not the same.
Vastly different.
Right.
Yeah. So what Julia did, which was super important, Julia took French cooking primarily through the lens of Le Cordon Bleu at that time, and the lens of Simone Beck, and adjacently Louisette Bourton, and recipized it for the American audience in the 1960s and then again in the 1970s. And that's definitely not what we're doing now at her house. And what's funny is calling it her house is so interesting because she never owned it because she wasn't allowed to own it back then. By the time she passed it back to the Beck family, she could have owned it, but the original agreement, that wasn't possible. So it was post World War II. Food was just changing in a very significant way. There was stuff happening in Berkeley with Alice, right? And I can never remember her restaurant name because I haven't eaten there.
Oh, Chez Panisse.
Yes, thank you. I should know that off the top of my head, but I don't. It's one of those things. I am a weird third culture child who's lived in a lot of places. And so like things I should know about, I don't. I know about it. I just can't always name it. So Chez Panisse was kind of happening in between Mastering the Art of French Cooking 1 and 2. And all of this like new food culture was emerging in the States. And it was moving from Jell-O salad to something that was more appealing. And God love the Jell-O salad. And like all of these things were happening. And so we couldn't really, when I bought the house, we couldn't really continue that. We couldn't really continue using the Mastering Art of French Cooking 1 or 2. And to be fair, the previous owner to me was Kathy Alex. In fact, she was kind of the first owner of the house, which is weird to say. And I used quotes for those of you who are just listening, air quotes, like the first owner, because the first owner was not Julia and it wasn't really Simone either. It was just kind of like Julia paid for the construction of the house. Simone had the land. And then the first person to buy it was Kathy Alex, and Kathy Alex didn't use either of those cookbooks either, but she was doing very much French forward cooking. And when I found the property, I just kind of had this very fast vision that there had to be a better way to teach cooking. As someone who had toiled through a lot of cookbooks in my life and just felt like they had half the answers, but not all the answers. And I wanted to solve cooking. And I don't know if I'm there yet, but I feel like I'm doing a pretty good job. I'm trying to create a way to talk about French cooking and farm to table cooking without recipes, without completely evading recipes. Do not get me wrong. I'm writing a cookbook with recipes. Let me tell you, my inner circle, who has been around for a while, like I run an online cooking school and in-person cooking school, and they're still aghast that there are recipes in the cookbook. And the answer is that writing about recipe-free cooking is hard. People have tried. It's not an easy thing to do, but it's a very easy thing to do when you have professionals who are supporting you in an in-person environment, which is really what we're doing at Le Peach. And we don't just run at Le Peach, to be fair. We now run around the world, less so, thank you, COVID. But we've successfully run in Vermont and Italy. We had to cancel a number of experiences because of COVID, but our plan had originally been to run in 6 countries a year. We're on hold with that. But we really tried to figure out a way to talk about cooking that people have tried to talk about and have started to talk about. People have touched it, but we really wanted to create a framework that people could just like fall into, which is what we really tried to do.
You make a lot of bold statements, I think, in regard to cookbooks, for example, written by people who are imperfect, recipe writers lie, recipe testers are often more skilled than you, which that's not a bold statement. I mean, there's a lot of, obviously that's true for the most of us anyway. And by the way, you don't have, I agree with everything that I've watched and heard and read that you say, because you have to keep it all in context, because you're not really saying recipe writers are liars. No. It's the context of the fact that the situations are different, the food, the elements, the climate, the equipment, everything's going to be, for the most part, different than what you're going to find in your own home kitchen. And so it can be, for some people, it just depends who they are and how they're wired, essentially. Because I have a friend who, she is a great cook and she literally only cooks with recipes, but she always modifies them, which is really very interesting because it's on the way to doing exactly what you're teaching at the Courageous Cooking School. So I think that all that is a launching point for basically, looking at how you developed your point of view about this. And I think that one of the things that was most interesting to me was it seemed like you, almost from the start of your culinary schooling, you felt like, wait a minute, there's something that's not right about how they're I mean, the stuff in the books is cool and all that stuff, but there's something that's not right about this approach. And that's
right. And so I had the experience of watching an ex-partner go through culinary school and watched them come home and try to recreate the recipe. They had almost no cooking experience when they went to culinary school. So they would do the recipe at culinary school and would come home to our apartment and fail miserably, which made no sense because they had just successfully done it 6 hours prior. Same ingredients, different equipment. And also maybe not the same ingredients, but like same-ish ingredients, right? Like from the same region. I mean, who knows where the culinary school got it? I don't know. But ultimately, I just started feeling very like, this isn't working. And one of the things that I've really tried to dive into is what is food and why does food work? And there's this kind of magic about how deliciousness happens. And deliciousness also is in the eye of the beholder. Mm-hmm. So I might offer you my perfect dish and you taste it and be like, more salt, please. Mm-hmm. Right. And the way that cooks and chefs are trained is in the eye of the sage on the stage, mm-hmm. right? Like culinary school, the culinary school I went to was all about that chef at that time. Every time there was a new head chef, the whole curriculum changed. It did. And don't get me wrong, pedagogy changes all the time. I'm cool with that, but it just didn't seem complete. And so one of the things I was really lucky to have is that my husband is a curriculum developer, and he really wanted to figure out how to codify good taste. And we came up with this method. Obviously, in the time we're talking, I can't explain it. It requires a little bit of time to explain, and we teach it and spend a lot of time on it. But one of the things that we found is that even when we show it to chefs, they go, oh God, why? How did I not think of that? And it's like, well, because it's not your job to think about that. You're not thinking about the why. You're just doing the how, which is fine. And you know, the difference between baking and cooking is cooking has a lot of space. Baking doesn't, because baking has chemistry that has to happen. And it doesn't matter how good it tastes. If it looks terrible, like utterly terrible, we really struggle with it when it comes to baked goods. But when it comes to cooking, who has ever said that beef bourguignon is attractive? But it's delicious. But who's ever tasted a chocolate chip cookie and been like, it's the ugliest thing, it's the most delicious? There's something about that chemistry that also makes it beautiful, and that plays into the tastes. Mm-hmm. So,
well, I'm glad you made that distinction too between baking and cooking, because for the most part, the Courageous Cooking School is about cooking, right?
Yes, 100%.
So one of the things that you say in the materials for the course is that your intuition is better than any book. You know what you are doing, even if you don't realize it just yet. And I absolutely love that, because so many people are simply just afraid to cook.
Yes.
And also, what you're doing is you're
what it is that someone gets me. It's like, this is thank you for getting me.
Well, the thing is that you immediately take away every issue just with that statement, because I can just see somebody sighing. They read that and go, you know, and it's just, it all can just fade away, and then they can just be themselves instead of coming to the table, that was bad, with all kinds of preconceived notions and all kinds of, you know, whatever. So
cliches are inevitable in cooking. It's fine. It wasn't bad. They come to the table. And you're right. The interesting thing about cooking specifically is, yes, you can screw up the technique of searing a steak. You can over-sear it, you can overcook it, but you probably can't wrongly flavor it. Now, what you taste as delicious, I might go, huh, because, oh, I don't know, we use cilantro to top our steaks. What, like 20% of the world has that gene that cilantro tastes like soap? And that's one of the things we always say on the first day of the Courageous Cooking School is like, hey, how many of you dislike cilantro? I have a broken gene. I don't really know if it's a gene, but I have a brokenness in me. And I mean that because I hate everything almond except for almonds.
Yeah, I heard you on a video say that, and I'm like, wow, I've never heard anybody. I've heard people say they didn't like lots of things, but almonds, that's the first time. I mean, it's not actually almonds, it's almond paste and almond extract. Right.
And like almonds, when they get too ripe and then when you bite into them, they taste like marzipan or almond extract. Yeah, but I love raw almonds. I love baked almonds. But the minute it's an extract, I'm like it's visceral. And which means that like I spent a lot of time cooking from recipes that included almonds. And I thought it was terrible. And of course I did, because and I don't know why I have that. I wish I had the easy Google capacity to be like, why do I hate almond extract? Because if you say, why do I hate cilantro? There's like 1,000, if not 20, if not 100,000 articles. Like, right. And I just don't like it. And so I have good friends who cook with a lot of almond extract. And they feed me a mousse au chocolat with almond extract. I'm like, no, thank you. Like, I just can't.
Mm-hmm. And this is a permission, actually, that you can give people, right? That you'd give people, that your taste, your palate, it doesn't mean that it can't change. It doesn't mean like loving Taco Bell and not liking it that much. It doesn't mean that it won't evolve over time. It doesn't mean that it can't become more familiar with items that maybe are not in your current taste universe. But no matter what, it's still you. It's still your subjective taste experience as opposed to anybody else's. And in the end, that's what you have to satisfy, right?
Right. And that's at the end, what recipe writers are satisfying is their tastes.
Their own.
And, right. Their own tastes. And the maybe 5 to 10 people who taste the dish before they publish it. And it might be 20, but like even 20 isn't a good random sample. And so a lot of people cook recipes from all sorts of famous people and just feel kind of bummed. And sometimes it's lack of skill, but often it's just not enough salt, too much butter, not enough butter, not enough of this type of spice, too much of this type of spice, because that's where their tastes lie. And, you know, like I love to think about the fact that I have a 3-year-old and there are certain things she strongly dislikes, but she has a very strong liking for acidic things. No surprise. My husband and I are both like, meh, on the sweets. We will eat dessert, but we don't crave desserts. Salt and vinegar potato chips. Oh, danger. Leave a bag. It's gone in a minute between the two of us. And she's the same way. And she also likes sweets. But she'll eat green salad if it has enough acid. If it's too oily, she won't touch it. And is that wrong? Now, her great-grandmother, who's 94, wouldn't touch the same salad that Magnolia touches. Like
Magnolia's your daughter.
Yes, Magnolia's my daughter. So it all comes down to, like, this is one of the things I struggle with while writing this cookbook I'm writing is like, how do I write the perfect vinaigrette? And my publisher and my editor constantly argue with me, and no harm, no foul. They're like, well, we want a recipe. And I'm like, how? Because I will make it and I will like it. My husband, Chris, will like it. Magnolia will be like, eh. And then my grandmother-in-law thinks it's too acidic. My mother-in-law thinks it's too oily. My mother, you get at this whole perspective. Sure. And then like, well, I've tested it. I've tested it 10 times. And I've presented it to 10 groups of 5 to 6 people. And there's still this bifurcation of interest. And so if you're trying to cook exclusively from cookbooks, of course, there's going to be things that fail for you.
Mm-hmm. But you have to let us in on the answer.
Yes.
What's the conclusion in terms of how you're going to present this to somebody who's looking at your vinaigrette recipe?
So one of the things I'm really working on is if this tastes too oily, but not saying too oily, if it feels like it coats your tongue too much. So I'm trying to use, we're really writing the cookbook differently as much as we can, even though it still has recipes. There's lots of cues about like, is it salty enough? Is it too salty? Here's how to fix it.
Beautiful.
Back to the vinaigrette. If it feels like it coats your mouth too much, because I can't say to a brand new cook who just bought my cookbook off the shelf at a random bookstore in New York, who's a undergrad and decides to buy it and then goes, what do you mean too oily? Do I even know what that means? They might not. So it's like, does it feel like it coats your tongue too much? Does it feel satisfactory? Does it make, I love to say, does it excite you? And if it doesn't excite you, here are ways to fix it.
Yeah.
And I will tell you that writing that way requires a lot more writing.
I would think so. I would think it'd be constantly really delving into just the most intricate details. But I got to say, can't wait to talk to you after that comes out, because that
I will come.
I mean, honestly, for somebody to have the opportunity, for people to have the opportunity to have a person like yourself create that perspective for them, it's going to be life-changing for a lot of people, I think. I mean, because look, what do we do most of the time? Well, we sleep a lot. And what else do we do? We eat a lot, right? and so that's going to be so many people. I don't even understand it. It doesn't fit into my world, that they don't have fun when they're eating, and so this is an opportunity. If you need me to, I don't know, you're going to do a commercial, I'll be a spokesperson for your book or something like that. Because obviously it just seems it's so natural. It's like the chefs who said to you, well, why didn't I think of that? It's like, why hasn't anybody done this before? I mean, what's the closest anybody's come? Maybe, I don't know, Simone Nazrat with salt, fat, acid, heat. I don't know exactly.
Nazrat got really, really, really close. And to be fair, her cookbook is a majestic piece of work. And, oh God, I hate to be recorded criticizing because we really have no criticism, but I think that the elements of good food can't just be salt, fat, acid, and heat. Heat is cooking. And I get all of it. Like, it's beautiful. And I love it so much. And I also know that she hated she had to add recipes. And I'm going through that same experience right now, right? Like, I also get that recipes sell cookbooks because some of us need it. I still look to recipes. Do not get me wrong. Like, I don't think that recipes are terrible. It's that one of the things I think that actually makes cooking happen is something that's kept behind closed doors with chefs and people who write cookbooks, home chefs, they guard a lot of it. And I don't think they're guarding it. I think they don't know how to talk about it. And we're still trying. And I'm not saying that like what I'm writing is going to solve what other people have done. That's not my point. The only thing I have is that my culinary director at the Courageous Cooking School is a Michelin-starred sous chef. She doesn't have her own personal Michelin star. Her name is Kendall Lane. She's young, she's hungry. We went to culinary school together. She had worked in kitchens for 10 years and still felt the need to go to culinary school. That's a problem with the industry too, right? Like, she worked for kitchens for 10 years and still felt the need. And it took a very long time for us to actually start to work together. And when I showed her my method, she went, well, duh. And I went, you can't say that. And she's like, you're right, I can't. And now she finds it creeping into her brain because she's like, oh, here's where the balance is off. So before, when chefs sit around and like taste a dish, they're just going, what's off? And I'm not saying the framework we offer and that I've built is the answer, but it's the first answer I have found. And this might be a little bit self-aggrandizing. I'm willing to admit that. I just haven't been able to do it. I have talked to other chefs. my head chef and culinary director at the culinary school, like, still is shocked by how simplistic our pyramid is. And don't get me wrong, I've pulled from people like Samin who have done the work before me. I have pulled from other places. And then we codified it in a way that was like very different and very clear. And I think you watched the video. So
yeah, no, it's great. It's look, cooking is a field just like anything else. If it's going to progress, then there have to be ongoing evolutions, we'll say. And
Absolutely.
maybe this is just one of the bright steps for a cooking home revolution, which is great for people to get people, because this is way beyond our discussion right now, but one of my major objectives is to get people to cook more at home, because I think it's fun. I think it's delicious. And I think it's also healthier for not only yourself, but also for your family, if you have a family that you're cooking for,
right,
especially if you get all of them involved in the process. So this sounds like a great kick to that whole thing forward.
It's definitely an evolution. It's not the evolution. We do joke about that it's the recipe-free revolution, because we just find, as a collective team, there's about 8 of us who work together. We've all worked in food and wine in various capacities for a while, or in teaching, which is important. And I think that's one of the things that's been missing from cooking teaching, is there weren't a lot of teachers involved. There were a lot of chefs involved, and they've all been taught in ways that weren't great pedagogy.
Right.
And we're just trying to find a new way for people to connect to food that's joyous and exciting. And beautiful. We try to give credit and credence to all the people who came before us. And, I mean, I didn't buy, I think there's a misconception that I bought Le Pichoun to become famous. I didn't. I think there's a misconception I bought Le Pichoun because I didn't have my own capacity to build my own food business. No, I did it because it seemed like a really solid business decision. And I really respect what happened here before, and not just Julia, but everybody else. MFK Fisher spent time there, and James Beard spent time there, and Simone Beck, who's become a huge muse for me. And her recognition is very limited in the world.
And an Iowan, Richard Olney, spent time there.
Yes, absolutely. And I fell in love with a window. Yes. That's really what it was.
Tell that story. Do you mind?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a Smith College graduate. Julia went to Smith College. And on a random day in November in 2015, and I think you mentioned the date as the 12th. I think it was the 15th, but I have to look. Who knows? Like, it was that week. And I saw this article in the alum forum for Smith about the house that Julia built. And all of these Smithies were talking about how they wanted to share it and like co-buy it. And the price was sub $1 million. And I thought, that's a lot of cooks in the kitchen. And I acknowledged my privilege to be like, well, maybe I could. It wasn't that I could. It's like, I knew I had investors or could find investors. I didn't know. I was just willing to try. And I saw that article and I was watching all these conversations, like, I'll throw in 10, I'll throw in 20. I'm like, how is that? That's not going to work. Like, maybe France has mortgages. Like, a lot of these women and non-binary people and men who have gone to college, I have to acknowledge that, we're talking about like a lot of small money when a lot of them own houses much more expensive than Le Peach. And I was like, there has to be a mortgage. And so I sent this kind of BCC email to everybody I knew in food and wine and was just like, wouldn't it be cool to own Julia Child's house? And I got a lot of responses back, not as many as that I sent. I got about 10%, which to me is a good response. So those of you who are thinking about starting a new venture, if you get 10% response back, that's a really good response, friends. And some were my parents and some were investors that weren't my family. And at the end of the day, the house was already sold, which is interesting. And the Bataclan attacks happened that night, the same day. That was the big shooting in Paris that happened that night, the same day the article went viral. And I already saw that it was sold, and I just kind of kept checking it and then saw it was back on the market by Monday of the same week. And when I came down so I was living in the mountains near the ski slopes between Vail and Beaver Creek, because I was a ski instructor at the time. I learned about that driving down, and again, I wasn't that attached to it. It was just like, it's an idea. So I just sent this random email. And when I came back up the hill, I just had this thought, that probably means whoever bought it was American, because it was sold before the exclusive article with the New York Times came out. And I bet they won't keep it. And they didn't. What's really interesting about this is at the end of the day, it wasn't an expensive purchase. I mean, I had to make a lot of expensive choices. My parents had to make some expensive choices. Refinancing houses, selling homes, all of that. But, the mortgage for the first 6 months, 4 years is only a few €100 a month, because they have interest-only loans in France, friends.
Nice.
So like this belief that it was this like, oh, you're so privileged. Yes, and totally. Do not get me wrong. I'm privileged that I was raised the way I was raised, that I went to the college I went to, that I had parents who believed in me and were willing to leverage themselves, and that I had a house that I had purchased and leveraged. But it was also tenacity, and not overwhelming tenacity. So a lot of people were on the same path, about 6. When I say a lot, it's very funny because I get a lot of emails, and that's not an exaggeration. They're like, I almost bought it. I'm like, cool. There were 6, because I'm friends with my real estate agent who sold it to us. There were 6. And those 6 were all fighting the same. Some were fighting too hard. Some were fighting not hard enough. And I just happened to find the middle ground. And there was a lot of luck, because there were people who had more money than me and my family, who happened to be the investors. And the owner said no. It was because I went to Smith, because I wanted to honor Kathy Alex's legacy and the Julia Child legacy, and also do my own thing. That was what sold her. So I was tenacious without being overly excited. I didn't call multiple times a day. I didn't email. I would send a thing, and then I'd wait a day. I'd send a thing, and I'd wait a day. And that's kind of how it happened.
Tell us about the window. There's 2 things. The window, if you just describe what that, how that set off what you've described, essentially. And then the second thing is the pillow, your grandmother.
Yes.
Right.
So the window was a picture on the New York Times website that had these 2 shutters with this red ivy underneath it and this green ivy around it. And the shutters had little heart cutouts, which is original, by the way. Like, I had never seen anything like that in my life. And and that was like the starter image on the article. And I was like, I want to be there. And so through that process of trying to figure out if we could buy it, I did all the work. We were still at a no from my family. We were still at a no at the time from my then partner. We're no longer together. No big deal, it just is. And I still kept setting up the meetings. And I was like, could you just show up to this meeting? Could you just show up to this meeting? Can we just do this meeting? And so because France doesn't celebrate the colonist holiday of Thanksgiving, we were able to have a meeting. And it was very much like we scheduled the meeting the day before. And at about 6 a.m. Colorado time, we just got on a phone call with a banker, a real estate agent, and we were just in an exploratory conversation, and we were sitting And during like the third exploratory conversation of 5 we did that day, it took about 3 hours. I just look up and look across from me, and there's this pillow that says my other house is in France. And I just die inside because we didn't have a house in France. And that was a gift from my grandmother, who helped us buy the house after she passed, in essence, from what she left the family. And it was the second time she had gifted my father that pillow. The other one was in a different house. This one was there. And it was just like, oh, I guess we're going to do this. And that was the moment when everybody was on board. They're like, oh, this damn pillow and this damn window. We're just going to make it happen. And it was not easy, but it's been worth it, even though the past couple of years have been really hard.
I'm going to repeat what you just said because I think it was so quiet. You said really hard. The past couple of years are really hard. I think most people can relate to that. So I wanted to make sure they heard it. It would be, but worth it. Right. It would be, I would be remiss, and I think you would be too, if we've been having so much fun talking and time's just gone flying by. But we haven't even, what do people do? Tell people where to find you. And also what's the experience going to be like for them if they decide that they want to go to have a courageous cooking school experience?
Absolutely. So at La Peach, we offer 2 La Peach specific experiences, which is like an almost all-inclusive summer where you have Kendall cooking for you and her husband, who's a somm, dealing with your wine, and we have a concierge. So that's really great. We call that the bespoke experience. And again, I used air quotes because a lot of people hate that word, but that's the best we can explain it. And then in the winter, you can just come and visit us and use us as you would like. And then during spring and fall, we offer the Courageous Cooking School experience, which is a 5-day intensive where you arrive on a Sunday and leave on a Friday. And we don't leave campus much. We go to a market, we go to a cheese shop. We don't eat out at any restaurants. You cook, whether it's you and 5 other friends or just you coming alone. We take care of you and we help you get over your issues with broccoli. In fact, the minute you tell us you have an issue with something, we're going to try to get you over it. Unless it's cilantro and it's genetic, we'll let that one go. We're not going to try to force any cilantro favorites into anybody. And it's really about going to the markets, bringing ingredients in and being excited about what you bring in and making something that excites you. And then also getting the feedback from the group, like, why did this work? Why didn't it? And what they liked and why they didn't, because that also helps you understand why recipes haven't served you. Because you're going to have people who are like, this is the best thing ever. So if you had recipized it and published it tomorrow, you've got maybe 2 or 3 friends who are going to be like, yes. And then you're going to have 1 or 2 who are going to go, I hated it. And that's also good feedback because it reminds you that there's a lot of tastes in the world.
Right.
So you can find us at lapeach.com, which is www.lapeetch.com.
PEETCH.com.
2 E's.
Right. LAPEETCH.com. Right.
Correct.
All right. Perfect. And so really, if we had to say, what the essence of this is, it's really discovering your own inner cook, really. I mean, it's an inner experience, right? So
yes. My favorite feedback I ever got from clients was, this isn't really a cooking school, is it? And I was like, no. And yes, it's both.
Right. Well, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to talk with you. Really a lot of fun. And it's always great to talk about food, but it's always even more fun to talk about food with somebody who you feel a kinship to. And so I feel a kinship to you. So thank you again for your time.
Me too. This was not just fun, but a lot of fun.
Great. So that's Makenna Held. She is the co-owner of La Pichoune, which is Julia Child's former home in Provence, France, and is the home of the Courageous Cooking School. You've been listening or watching, perhaps, Great Taste. I'm your host, Steve Boss, and I'll leave you with the same 3 little words that I always leave you with. And those 3 little words are cook with joy.
Great taste. Sweet. Sour. So good to taste.